On November 23rd, John and I drove down to the Hudson DMV. We live in Osceola, Wisconsin, and Hudson is about an hour south of from us. And we drove down there hoping to get our Wisconsin driver's licenses. We moved here from Iowa about a year and a half ago, and we really needed to update our licenses to Wisconsin. So we went down and we went on the day before Thanksgiving, as I said, because we both were lucky enough to have that day off work, and it's a long haul down to Hudson, and then it takes some time at the DMV, and it's a long haul back up, so we wanted to do it on a day where we didn't have work. So we got there and went in, and the first thing is, almost immediately as we walked in, another customer, patron at the DMV told us that the computers were down and that he'd been there all morning. We must have gotten there sometime around 10 or 11. He said he'd been there since it opened, and that he was still unable to get his business taken care of because the computers were down. So we thought, oh, what a bummer. The one day we could come here, the computers are down, we can't get our licenses.
The first thing that happened was, again, the computers were down, which is fair enough. Computers go down, I understand that. But then it was strange because as we asked about what it would take, I walked in there with a current state of Iowa driver's license with my name and my date of birth, all that was on it, as well as a social security card, as well as proof of residence here, a bank statement, a paycheck stub, and so, I figured I was good. And they just explained no, and I asked why not, and they said, that isn't proof of, he said, that doesn't count as proof of your identity, because an Iowa driver's license is not adequate proof of who I am by this law. Now I don't know if that was correct or not, but they told me that wouldn't work. And then they also said that I had no proof that I was a United States citizen. A social security card doesn't work because all it does is give proof that at one point I was allowed to work here.
But then the gals behind the counter encouraged us to go ahead and fill out our paperwork and come on up anyway, and maybe in hopes that the computers would be running again by the time we needed our licenses. So we filled out the paperwork. The paperwork looked much the same as it's looked everywhere I've gotten a new driver's license. I've lived in several states and gotten driver's licenses in Nevada, Alaska, Iowa, and previously in Wisconsin. So I've been through the process before. So the paperwork looked good, and we went up to the counter, and the gal asked for identification, and I gave her my Iowa state driver's license, which was expired. And I gave her a pay stub, my current pay stub for my school district, St. Croix Falls, where I teach. And she said that that didn't count as proof of identification. And I asked her what I needed, and she said I needed either a birth certificate or a passport, neither of which I had. So, after a little bit of back and forth about was she sure that I needed a passport or birth certificate, it turned out yes. In fact, she was sure, and she was right. I did need, in the state of Wisconsin, either a passport or a certified birth certificate to get my license. I then asked her, well, okay, if I can't get my license today, can I get a voter ID so that I could be sure to vote in the next election? I've never missed a single election. I voted in every election since I was 18, and I certainly do not want to miss the coming election. And she said, no, I couldn't get that either because I would need to have either a certified birth certificate or a passport to get a voter ID as well.
It's hard in that situation not to want to argue with these women who are working there, and but at the same time, you realize they're just employees. So, but it just seemed that, here, that it was so difficult for us to get this taken care of, and again, I had quite a lot of the type of documentation that you think would work, and that you just have to imagine how many other people, if they were turned around once after having taken time off work, after having made a trip, 30, 40, 50 miles away to get this taken care of, might not try it again.
I was super, super frustrated at that point, and so, I'd watched John struggle to get his too, and he was also denied, and so we left.
It feels like just naked power politics. It feels as if at a certain point Walker and the Republicans in Wisconsin just decided that they were going to go a straight partisan route, that they were just going to power play after power play, marginalizing the others, surrendering this notion that they serve both parties, they serve all Wisconsinites. It's rather what they're doing is they're kind of grabbing power and hanging on to it. Again, what you'd hope is that some of them would feel that they are depriving Wisconsin citizens of voting, and yet you almost feel as if at a certain level they feel that these people don't really deserve to vote. Hey, you don't have a license, you don't really deserve to vote anyway. At times, just the way these things are moving, the way some of these political initiatives are moving like a wave across the kind of swing states and across some of the Republican states, it feels as if there is some type of think tanks, conservative think tanks and conservative policy institutes who are kind of issuing these recommendations or these strategies. It feels very strategic. The voter ID, the other thing to keep in mind is that the notion, voter fraud is wrong, but on the other hand, you would have to basically come up with an army of fraudulent voters to have any real effect. We're Osceola, we're a town of 1,400 people. Voter fraud in just so many ways in Wisconsin just isn't an issue. We just don't have the population base to really make that the type of problem. So it's a manufactured problem. It didn't really affect our state before. And suddenly they're passing a bunch of laws which are ultimately restrictive and don't seem to be fixing the problem.
I'm certainly not a conspiracy theorist in general, but it does seem a little suspicious to me that this voter ID law came up now in this time when our state is incredibly divided, and there's a lot of anger right now toward Governor Walker and some of the Republican lawmakers. Here we have this law that has the potential to disenfranchise just an incredible number of voters. And again, it doesn't seem like a coincidence to me that when you look at the statistics and who in Wisconsin already would be able to vote if this new law were in effect right now. So to be specific, who in Wisconsin already has either a driver's license or a voter ID card. And you look at some of those statistics and you find that it's a real minority of African American voters and a real minority of Latino voters that would would be allowed to vote right now, given the restrictive voter ID law. When you think about the percentages of African American voters and Latino voters who tend to vote Democratic, it just doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. It seems politically motivated.
The one thing that bothers me is that these laws are flying in the face of the civil rights legislation, which was one of the proudest moments in the history of our country. When we made a decision as a people that enfranchising voters was more important than kind of minor considerations of procedural niceties. It was a decision. They've already weighed this question. The Supreme Court has weighed it, the legislature has weighed it, the executive branch. They weighed this question of what's more important, people's right to vote versus, a kind of exact, attention to every kind of, cross T and dotted I of procedural rules. And they decided, no, America said that people voting is more important than these things, that it's worth a little bit of risk to have people vote. Most of these politicians who are passing this legislation, they know that. They know the history of this country. They lived through it. A lot of these people aren't that, are fairly old. They know that battle happened. They know how it ended, and they know why it ended. Because for exactly the same reasons. They know that during the Voter Rights Acts in the 1960s, it was because documentation was used as a justification for keeping African Americans away from the polls. And at the time, the courts and the government and the Justice Department all said, no, that's not acceptable, and yet we forget. And now it's 40, 50 years later, and it's happening again.